On December 3rd, the wind changed and winter arrived. Nat Hawken, a farmer with a wartime disability, worked part-time on the farm, enjoying solitary tasks like hedging and thatching. He loved watching birds, especially during autumn when they would flock together, restless and uneasy, driven by an instinct to move. Nat observed that this autumn, the birds were more agitated than usual, and their numbers were greater. One evening, Nat's wife remarked on the unusual bird behavior, and the farmer predicted a harsh winter. That night, the east wind brought a chill, and Nat heard the sea roaring in the bay. He woke up to the sound of tapping on his window and found a bird trying to get in. The bird had scratched his hand, drawing blood. When the tapping continued, Nat found half a dozen birds on the sill, attacking him. The birds then invaded the children's room, and Nat fought them off with a blanket, eventually defeating them. In the morning light, he was shocked to find the bodies of over 50 small birds, including robins, finches, and sparrows, that had died in the battle. Nat's family was shaken when birds invaded their home, attacking them in the dark. The next morning, Nat tried to reassure his wife and children that it was just the harsh weather that drove the birds in. But as he looked out at the frozen landscape, he knew something was off. The birds, usually a sign of life and beauty, were dead, littering the bedroom floor. Nat's wife was terrified, and he didn't want to admit that he was too. As the day went on, Nat tried to make sense of the strange event. He talked to his wife, his daughter Jill, and the farmhands, but no one seemed to take him seriously. Even Mrs. Trigg, the kind-hearted farm owner, thought he must have had a nightmare. Nat knew what he saw, though, the birds' small beaks jabbing at him, their tiny bodies piling up on the floor. As Nat collected the dead birds and buried them in the garden, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The weather was harsh, but it wasn't just that. Something had driven those birds to madness, and Nat feared it might happen again. Nat stood on the beach, feeling the biting east wind. The weather was unnatural, and the wind was so strong that it hurt to breathe. He had never experienced such cold before. He was there to bury the 50 frozen birds he had found, but the wind swept them away, scattering them along the beach. As he looked out to sea, he saw thousands of gulls riding the waves, waiting for something. Nat returned home, where his wife told him about a special news bulletin on the wireless. Reports were coming in from all over the country about massive flocks of birds causing obstruction and damage. The government warned people to secure their homes and take precautions. Nat was excited, knowing that he had seen the same phenomenon on the beach. He boarded up the windows and chimneys, remembering the old days of war preparations. His wife didn't understand why he was taking such measures, but Nat was thinking of the gulls. As the day went on, the news only got worse. The birds were causing chaos in cities, and the government was warning people to be careful. Nat's wife suggested calling in the army to shoot the birds, but Nat knew it was impractical. As night fell, Nat checked their food supplies, knowing that they might not be able to go shopping tomorrow. He was preparing for the worst, but he didn't want to scare his wife. Nat and his wife lived in a cottage by the sea. They struggled to make ends meet, and Nat's wife complained about the lack of food and candles. Nat went out to the garden and saw a strange sight: thousands of gulls circling silently in the sky. He felt a sense of unease and told his wife to keep their son Johnny inside and lock the door. He went to the bus stop to meet his daughter Jill, taking a hoe with him. On the way, he saw more birds, including rooks, crows, and jackdaws, flying inland. He reported this to the authorities, but they seemed uninterested. When Jill arrived, Nat hurried her home, noticing the gulls circling overhead. He met the farmer, Mr. Trigg, who was preparing to shoot the birds, but Nat declined to join him. As he walked home, he saw the gulls circling lower, with the black-backed gulls leading the way. He realized they were targeting the farm and increased his pace. The farmer offered to give him a lift, but Nat declined, warning him to board up his windows. As Nat approached his cottage, a black-backed gull dived down at him, missing him but preparing to attack again. Nat, a farmer, was working in his field when suddenly, a flock of black-backed and herring gulls attacked him. They pecked at his skin, drawing blood, and Nat ran towards his cottage, desperate to escape. His wife, who was inside with their children, Johnny and Jill, heard his cries for help and opened the door just in time. The gulls were relentless, and Nat's wife tended to his wounds while trying to calm the frightened children. As the attack continued, Nat realized that the birds were not just attacking him, but were also targeting the towns. He boarded up the windows and doors, preparing for a long siege. His wife was terrified, but Nat tried to reassure her that they would be safe as long as they stayed indoors. The family huddled together in the kitchen, listening to the sounds of the birds outside. They heard the news on the radio, which announced a national emergency and warned people to stay indoors and protect their homes. The broadcast ended abruptly, and Nat realized that the situation was more dire than he had thought. As night fell, the family tried to distract themselves with supper and conversation, but the sounds of the birds outside were ever present. Nat knew that they had to be prepared to defend themselves, and he wondered how long they could hold out against the relentless attacks. Nat and his family were huddled in their cottage, waiting for the authorities to take action against the aggressive birds that had been attacking them. They heard the sound of planes overhead, which Nat's wife believed were sent to shoot the birds. However, Nat knew that the planes were likely on a reconnaissance mission and would be no match for the birds. He didn't want to worry his wife, so he kept his concerns to himself. As the night wore on, the family heard the sound of crashing aircraft in the distance. Nat knew that the authorities' efforts were futile and would only lead to more loss of life. He was relieved when the planes stopped coming and the naval guns ceased firing. Nat's wife and children were exhausted, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that they needed to be prepared for the next attack. He went outside to survey the damage and found dead birds everywhere. He had an idea to use the bodies to block the windows and prevent the living birds from breaking in. He worked in the darkness, hating the task, but knowing it was necessary. When he finished, he barricaded the kitchen door and took a short rest. His wife woke him up, frantic, saying that the birds had started attacking again. Nat realized that he had forgotten to tend to the fire, and the smell of singed feathers filled the kitchen. He knew that the birds were coming down the chimney and quickly lit the lamp and made a fire to scare them away. Nat, his wife, and their children, Jill and Johnny, huddled together in their cottage, surrounded by the eerie sounds of birds tapping and scratching at the windows. The family had barricaded themselves inside, trying to escape the relentless attack of the birds. Nat's wife was terrified, but he tried to reassure her. "There's nothing to be afraid of, stop crying." As the night wore on, Nat worked to keep the fire burning, knowing it was their only defense against the birds. He made tea and cocoa for the family, trying to keep their spirits up. But the sounds of the birds continued, and Nat began to worry about the chimney, fearing it might catch fire. As the hours passed, the family heard the thuds of birds crashing into the windows, and Nat tried to distract them by talking about the birds' persistence. But he couldn't shake off the feeling of unease, especially when he heard the sound of birds breaking into the children's bedroom upstairs. Nat prepared for the worst, gathering furniture to barricade the door and planning their escape. As the first light of dawn approached, the birds' attacks subsided, and Nat realized the tide was turning. He switched off the wireless, knowing they wouldn't receive any news broadcasts. With the birds gone, Nat and his family emerged from their cottage, finding themselves surrounded by the living birds, watching and waiting. Nat knew they had to find food and supplies to survive, and he decided to head to the nearby farm. His wife begged to come with him, and he agreed, knowing they couldn't stay alone in the cottage. Nat, his wife, and their children, Jill and Johnny, prepared to face the harsh wind, wearing gloves and scarves. They set out to visit Mrs. Trigg, but Nat sensed something was off and told his wife to wait with the children while he investigated. At the farm, he found a disturbing scene: dead gulls, smashed windows, and the bodies of Jim and Mrs. Trigg. The cows were agitated, and the living birds watched him with an unnerving stillness. Nat returned to his family and told them they would load up the car with supplies from the farm. They made 3 trips, gathering essential items like food, candles, and planking for the windows. On their final trip, Nat tried to call for help, but the phone line was dead. He realized the birds were gorged from feeding during the night and were now waiting, watching, and not moving. As they drove back to their cottage, Nat's wife whispered to him to drive quickly past a gate where the postman's body lay. They arrived at the cottage, and Nat worked to secure the windows and doors, testing every opening and fixing boards across the chimneys. He cursed the authorities for their inefficiency and lack of action. As he worked, Nat noticed the gulls rising from the sea and the family huddled together, listening to the tapping and rustling of the birds outside. Nat's wife wondered if America would intervene, but Nat remained silent, focused on preparing their defenses. Nat recognized the hawk's beaks tapping and wings brushing against the door. They ignored the windows, focusing on breaking through the door. Nat wondered about the ancient memories stored in the hawk's brains, driving them to destroy humans with precision. He told his wife, "I'll smoke that last cigarette," regretting not bringing it from the farm. He turned on the silent radio, threw the empty pack on the fire, and watched it burn.